the 10 faces of an abuser. This video is about domestic violence, domestic abuse. It's about the recent back-to-back murder-suicides in Houston that were predicated with domestic violence. Domestic violence or domestic abuse led up to these recent flurry of murder-suicides in Houston. My goal here is to talk about the 10 faces of an abuser that I identified by reviewing these recent events in the Houston area. My goal is to shed some light on the characteristics of these abusers, so maybe we can hopefully prevent similar violence in the future by identifying the indicators and warning signs that led up to these tragic events. Okay, so before I really begin, I want to talk about the 10 faces of an abuser, but also what they have in common. The one thing that all abusers have in common is a desire to have power and control over the victim. That is the unifying force, if you will, or the unifying desire that ties them all together. So first I want to do is I want to talk about the two most serious forms of violence, but not necessarily the most common. And then I want to switch gears and talk about the most common forms of domestic abuse in detail. And start from the top of the most common, the most relevant, and then just kind of work our way down a little bit. But by no means am I minimizing any form of abuse at all. All forms of abuse are very serious, so none are being minimized. But what I'm doing is I am attempting to articulate what types of abuse we can expect to see more often than others. Okay, so let's first start with the top two most serious forms of domestic violence. That would be sexual violence and physical violence. Now, there's a myth about sexual violence, sexual assault, and you can listen to take a look at some of my other podcasts. I go into very great detail on what sexual assault actually is and what you can do to help someone who is the victim of sexual assault. Now, sexual assault doesn't necessarily require penetration. That's been established for a long time. There are different forms of sexual assault, ranging from sexting or just sending unwanted, unsolicited, inappropriate photographs, voyeurism, that's like peeping on the victim or spying on the victim. Other forms of a sexual assault can be just unwanted advances. These are forms of sexual violence. So there's not always a touching requirement. And even if there is touching, a sexual assault can still take place even in the absence of a penetration. And even if there is penetration, at any time, consent can be withdrawn. Just because a victim is already in an established relationship with the abuser and maybe consented in the past doesn't mean that they consent now. Okay, now physical violence is also extremely important. Again, physical violence doesn't always necessarily require a touching. It can also require a threat of physical force. If, if it's very, these cases are very fact intensive, very fact specific. So it's really good to talk to a domestic violence lawyer to help explain what the criminal code states, what the family code states, and even though the state code on, for example, family law might say one thing, but you really want to talk to a domestic violence attorney who's actually been in the courtroom and maybe has a rapport with the judge and kind of has a better feel for what the judge is looking for when they lean in favor of the victim or not. So that's physical violence. Okay, so now I want to switch gears a little bit. Excuse me. I want to switch gears a little bit. Now I want to talk about the most common types of abuse. Most common types of abuse, I would say, would be emotional abuse, economic abuse, isolation, and intimidation. Those would be I would say definitely the top four. Of the top four, I would probably put emotional abuse at the very top. So let's start there. Okay, so emotional abuse. Most common form of abuse today. What are the indicators and warning signs of emotional abuse? Maybe if you witness the abuser constantly putting the victim down, or maybe making the victim feel bad about themselves, or just calling the victim names, insulting them, making them feel guilty, humiliating the victim, um, making the victim feel bad about themselves, and also playing mind games. So a perfect example of mind games, also known as gaslighting, is when it's like crazy making behavior, making the victim feel like they cannot go forward without the abuser in their life. They need the abuser. An example would be of gaslighting or mind games might be the abuser hides the victim's keys, and then the abuser obviously finds the keys and then berates the victim for losing them, making the victim feel incompetent, humiliated, make them feel guilty, and that they somehow need the abuser because they're just too incompetent to do anything on their own. That is emotional abuse. Now, I do want to talk about gaslighting for a second. It is a word that's fallen into common usage in the last 10 years, but it's actually based off of an old movie called Gaslight, where a husband would, when he would leave the house, he would actually dim the gas lights. This is an old movie before electricity. He would dim the gas lights to make his wife think she was losing it, and then when he would come home, he would turn it back on and or make the lights brighter. He would just do it to as a type of mind game. That's where the word gaslighting actually comes from. It's crazy making behavior, playing mind games on the victim. Okay, so emotional abuse. I see it in nearly all of my divorce, custody, domestic violence cases. There's always some level of emotional abuse. Now, emotional abuse many times can be the parties can fix the emotional abuse on their own, maybe go to couples therapy. It's usually pretty serious when lawyers have to get involved. Okay, so that's emotional abuse. Now, I want to talk about another type of abuse. It's called isolation. So it's hard to identify because when the abuser is isolating the victim, they're controlling their behavior, limiting their outside involvement. So we don't always really see the indicators and warning signs of isolation, but let me go ahead and tell you what it is. Isolation is when you control what the victim does, who the victim sees and talks to, maybe even what they're allowed to read, where they are allowed to go, and their outside involvement is highly limited. And many times the abuser uses jealousy as a reason to justify their actions. And I'm going to go ahead and call out, well, not going to call out anybody specific, but it is Houston. It is a very international city, and we do have a lot of people here from around the world, people who are English is not their first language. Texas, Houston, United States, this is not where they grew up for a significant amount of period of their life. They're just not familiar. So naturally, they would be maybe feel isolated, and it's a little bit easier to limit their involvement with others because of the language barrier. It's easier to control who they see and talk to. Another great way to isolate a victim is if they're an immigrant, take their papers, take their passport. Yeah, it's illegal, but it is one way that I've seen victims be isolated. That's isolation, and it can also very quickly spin into human trafficking. So it's a very again, because someone is being, their involvement in the outside is highly limited. We don't always immediately see the indicators and warning signs, but when they are being subjected to abuse and jealousy is being used as a reason to justify actions, it could quickly spin into a domestic violence situation. And we see these back-to-back murder suicides in Houston. Okay, so that isolation. Okay, another common form of abuse that I see is intimidation. Okay, what is intimidation? Maybe it's making the victim afraid by the way you look at them, actions you take, gestures. So what looks, I mean, you can look at someone with a very intimidating face, and if there's a history of abuse, they can be very afraid. Okay, let's talk about actions. Maybe smashing things, smashing their laptop, destroying their property. If they have a precious animal like a dog or a cat or a bunny rabbit that's very important to them and gives them a lot of emotional support, well, abusing pets, abusing that animal would be a way to intimidate the victim. Also, and this is something that I notice and I take issue with, is displaying weapons during a divorce or a separation or some type of custody matter. Okay, yeah, I support the Second Amendment. No, there's no doubt about that. But what I take issue with is when the firearms have been locked up for years, untouched, and then suddenly the abuser decides to start cleaning their weapons during the divorce. That is intimidation. That is intimidation. Yes, nothing illegal has been done, but just the fact that you are suddenly decided to display firearms during a contested matter, that's intimidation. Me personally, I would not hesitate to set up for hearing and squash that behavior. Okay, so that's intimidation. Let's talk about another common type of abuse, and that's economic abuse. Controlling somebody with money. Congress, that's what Congress says. They can regulate behavior using money. Money is a very powerful force in this society, and it can certainly be used as a tool to economically abuse a victim. So let's talk about what is economic abuse. Maybe preventing the victim from getting a job or keeping a job. Maybe making the victim ask for money or giving them a very small allowance. Taking their money, not letting them know about or not letting them have access to or knowledge about family finances, the family income. Now, okay, so how does that apply to me? Okay, so what? All right, if the abuser is calling the victim at work 5 times a day and is frustrating the victim's ability to hold a job, then I would say that counts as different other types of abuse that I've already spoken of and I'm about to go into next. But I would argue that's actually a form of economic abuse because, well, you're also intimidating them, but you're also jeopardizing their ability to have a job. So when I said preventing the victim from getting or keeping a job, if you're constantly harassing them at work and they lose that job, well, then they're going to suddenly become more dependent on the abuser because they don't have that means to support themselves anymore. So when I talk about the 10 faces of an abuser, economic abuse is more than just withholding money, not giving them money, putting them on an allowance. It can be anything that involves hurting their ability to make a living. And that involves calling them at work, harassing them at work, stalking them at work, freaking out the employees over there. It happens a lot, unfortunately. Um, I'm in my 40s. I'm much older, much wiser. I've learned a lot. Well, oh gosh, I don't want to talk about how old I am, but probably close to 20 years ago, when I was very young, I was in the U.S. Army, and a lot of trash talk with the soldiers. One soldier, I don't remember their name. I believe this was in Kentucky. Uh, was bragging about how before going on a deployment, he gave his wife like a $50 a month allowance or something insanely low. Being young and immature, a lot of us had a good laugh about it. But being older now and domestic violence lawyer, I feel bad that I even was even near that conversation. It was so inappropriate. But when you're in the army, when you're with your buddies, everyone's talking trash about something, and something like that slips in. You don't do anything about it. You don't call that person out. I really, that's one of my big regrets, was not calling them out. But then again, I think with age comes wisdom. Okay, so that was economic abuse. Other important types of abuse would be minimizing, denying, and blaming the victim. Okay, so minimizing. Let's talk about minimizing. The abuser maybe makes light of the abusive behavior and decides not to take the victim's concerns about it seriously, saying it was not as serious as it really was, or it's not that big of a deal. Another type of abuse would be denying, saying the abuse didn't happen. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I wasn't being abusive. I didn't hit you. You're crazy. Um, Denying the abuse ever took place. Blaming. Let's talk about blaming. Okay, so an abuser becomes abusive, but they want to shift responsibility and actually say it's the victim's fault. So shifting responsibility and saying that the victim caused the abuse. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. That is its own face of the 10 faces of an abuser. Remember, all of these faces have one thing in common, and that is a desire to have power and control over the victim. Okay, so that was minimizing, denying, and blaming. Let's go into some more, I guess, specialized areas of abuse using children. Children can be weaponized in a family law matter, used as a tool to hurt the other spouse. So how have children been used to abuse the victim? Maybe making the victim feel guilty about the children, maybe using the children to relay messages. The messages concerning custody or educational, medical, dental decisions concerning children, that needs to go through the adults. That needs to go through the parents, or at least some type of co-parenting app where they don't have to directly communicate, but they can communicate this important information without relaying messages through the children. It's inappropriate. They need to learn how to co-parent. And I've got other podcasts on that, trust me. Okay, so another way to abuse a victim by using children, it would be using visitation to harass the other parent. Oh, gosh. When it's time for one parent to surrender the children to the other parent for their period of possession, dropping off, yeah, there's a million and one ways, creative ways to harass the other parent just during that exchange. Somehow make them feel bad. And of course, just generally making them feel guilty about the children, using children. Okay, I would pray that we are past this in this day and age in the 21st century, but unfortunately we're not. We still have instances of male privilege. Male because it's men mostly. I'm not going to ever speak in absolutes and say only men, but it's called male privilege for a reason because it's mostly men, 99.9% probably. But treating the woman like a servant, making all the big decisions, not letting her have a equal footing in the relationship, acting like the master of the castle, like you should be served. That would be a good example of male privilege, which is a recognized form of domestic abuse. Let's talk about the last face of an abuser. And again, I'm not minimizing any face or saying one face is more important than any other. I just started at the top, what I thought was most common, and just kind of worked my way down. But coercion and threats would be the final phase. But honestly, I don't believe it belongs at the bottom of the list. It's probably somewhere in the middle, right? Maybe a little bit closer to emotional abuse than you think. It really depends because every relationship is different. But coercion and threats. What is an example of coercion and threats. Maybe making a plan to do something to hurt the victim, or making a plan to threaten and carry out that desire or that plan to hurt the victim. Another example of coercion and threats might be threatening to leave the victim. Happens all the time. Always threats of to leave each other. Uh, Threats to commit suicide. It's actually a little bit more common than you think in my domestic violence and my divorce cases. Maybe one threat, maybe one spouse has a mental health issue and they control the victim by always threatening to kill themselves. Like, well, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. If you do this, I'm going to kill myself. If you don't give me money, I'm going to kill myself. You'd be surprised. I see it. And, that is a toxic, horrible reason to stay in an abusive relationship, because the abuser is holding themselves hostage. And if the victim doesn't subject themselves to the power and control of the abuser, then the abuser is going to hurt themselves. It's just a horrible relationship to be in. And I'm sorry that they're threatening to commit suicide, but you need to get out of that relationship. It's not safe. This is how murder suicides happen. So if they're going to kill themselves, that's unfortunate, but you need to get out of that relationship, and they can go to an emergency room, go get therapy. But the victim needs to get out of that relationship. So yes, threats of suicide. Other types of threats and ways to coerce the victim would be threatening to report them to welfare, because maybe they're on some type of a federal assistance that's based on household size, and maybe it's only the funding's only designed for single moms, but she maybe has a man over at the apartment, and I don't know, but just creative ways. Or maybe she has a side hustle, you know, uh, selling things on Craigslist or something, which may or may not be a violation of the her welfare conditions. I don't know, but there's 1,001 ways to report somebody to welfare, or 1,001 reasons. So that would be maybe a way to coerce the victim. Another way to coerce and threaten a victim would be maybe to um, make them drop charges, make them lie to the prosecutor, lie to the police about the domestic violence, and that bad things are going to happen if they do not retract their statement to the police, to the attorney, to the prosecutor, to the victim advocates, whatever. Um, Also, making them do illegal things. Sucking the victim into the abuser's, I don't know, credit card scams or whatever illegal side hustle they're doing that involves doing things that are illegal, like stealing. Okay, so to kind of wrap everything up, there have been a series of back-to-back murder suicides in Houston in just the last few weeks. It's very serious. These murder suicides. One common thing I noticed in many of them was a lot of it was based off of family violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And it was a situation that became very serious and led to the abuser killing the victim and then killing themselves. Um, if you look at the 10 faces of the abuser: physical violence, sexual violence, emotional abuse, intimidation, isolation, economic abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, uh, male privilege and coercion and threats. You see all these different faces of the abuser, but one thing they all have in common is a desire to have power and control over the victim. And I believe that if we can have a higher level of understanding of what these indicators and warning signs are, then maybe we can actually prevent some of these instances of domestic violence that lead to more serious incidents later. Thank you for listening to my video. I also have a great podcast where I go into more in-depth analysis of the different faces of an abuser. I even go inside the mind of the narcissist, inside the mind of the abuser, and try to have a better understanding of what makes them tick. Now, the reason I do this is because when you read training materials, a lot of it's geared towards helping the victim, which we should do. We need to protect and help the victim. But my thought process is, well, let's try to understand the abuser. I'm not defending their behavior. I'm not sympathizing. I just want to understand what is going on so we can hopefully identify those indicators and warning signs and try to prevent future violence. So again, thank you for listening. Check out my podcast. Check out some of my videos. I got some great articles out there too. Please consider subscribing. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.